Ladies and gentlemen, we are brought today to discuss, or rather to reckon with, Melkor, once the mightiest of the Ainur, the self-proclaimed enemy of all creation, and the author of his own inevitable, miserable defeat. If there is a figure in Tolkien's mythology deserving of a meticulous dissection, both as a cautionary tale and as an object of morbid fascination, it is Melkor, who later styled himself Morgoth. His name will live in infamy, but not because he was misunderstood or because he fought bravely for a cause worth fighting for. Quite the contrary. Melkor stands as a monument to the futility of rebellion against what one knows deep down to be the unalterable course of truth. He is the tragic artist who mistakes his canvas for a prison, slashing his own masterpiece while railing against the very laws of creativity that made his expression possible. Let us begin appropriately enough at the beginning. Melkor is not merely a rebel. He is the original iconoclast, the ultimate malcontent. One can almost imagine him, at the birth of the cosmos, as the first harmonies of Ilúvatar began to weave their inevitable grand music, stirring, fidgeting, perhaps even rolling his eyes in contempt. The other Ainur, even the greatest among them, willingly merged their voices into the music of the Ainur, adding depth and complexity, each knowing their note was part of something larger, something beyond themselves. But not Melkor. For Melkor, this collective creation was insufficient. He heard the music, and he despised its order and predictability. His arrogance could not bear to be but one note in a symphony. He wanted to be the conductor, the whole damn orchestra. Melkor's rebellion was not one of political ambition, nor even of personal freedom. It was a rebellion against harmony itself, against inevitability, if you will. He sought to impose his own discordant notes upon the music, not to enrich or add nuance to the song, but to warp it, to wrench it off key. And here lies the first great irony that marks Melkor's tragic career. His every effort to spoil the music was already known to Ilúvatar, already woven into the larger scheme. His thrashing and discord, far from wrecking the composition, only gave it a somber grandeur, a complexity it would not have otherwise possessed. Melkor, in all his rebellion, only ever managed to become the darkness against which the light shone more brilliantly. He became an unwilling collaborator in a story greater than he could fathom. It would be a mistake, however, to think that Melkor's hatred stemmed from mere impatience or irritation at the divine design. His fear, and let us not mince words, fear it was, stemmed from something much more personal. Melkor despised the unpredictability of other beings' free will. Sauron, his servant and apprentice in villainy, sought power and dominion, but always in service to a greater order, albeit a dark one. Melkor, on the other hand, wished to be rid of unpredictability itself. He hated the elves and later men because, unlike the other Ainur, these children of Ilúvatar embodied an autonomous will that could not be fully subdued. And here is the dark genius of Tolkien's mythology. Even the great and powerful, those who would seemingly have no reason for fear, can be utterly terrified by the freedom of others. Melkor's thrashing, his malevolent outbursts, and his desperate need to dominate, these are not the actions of a fearless dark lord. They are the tantrums of a divine being terrified by the prospect of beings whose paths are not scripted, whose future is not set. He knows that men and elves can make choices that will ultimately thwart his best-laid plans. The ringwraiths, his 9, are terrifying because they have surrendered their wills, because their actions are as predictable as a storm's inevitable onslaught. But until they fall, until they submit, until that final moment of corruption, Melkor fears them, as Sauron, too, later fears Frodo, because unpredictability and individual will are forces outside his ability to dominate. When Sauron sends out the Nazgul with absolute trust, it is an act born of desperation. Melkor himself trusted none wholly, because even corrupted, even under his dominion, there was a nagging awareness, however deeply suppressed, that the wills of others could change, could turn against him. He loathed freedom, not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood all too well that despite his power, it was something beyond his control. Freedom, that wretched, indomitable force, was the one note he could not silence. Consider the Nazgul, his ringwraiths, who themselves were not born into darkness but were men, kings, each drawn into the abyss by their own weaknesses. There is something profoundly sad, almost pitiful in Melkor's fear, even after corruption. He has turned these beings into instruments, and yet a part of him fears, or at least remembers, what they were before. If you consider the narrative Tolkien leaves for us, it becomes apparent that the conversion of each of the nine was not instantaneous. It took time, and that fact, that delay, is the very thing that gnawed at Melkor's own conception of his dominion. The last of the nine, that final reluctant surrender, is the crack in the edifice of Melkor's facade, a reminder that even the mighty must wait upon the choices of lesser beings. In that sense, Melkor feared even the very forces he claimed to command, for the prospect of failure lay embedded in every individual will. That the last of the Nazgul took time to break serves as an object lesson to Melkor's limitations. It reveals a gap between what Melkor aspired to and what he actually achieved. He was no Sauron, coldly efficient and systematic in his dark designs. No, Melkor was chaotic, his goals shifting and his fears continually reshaping his strategies, and thus he could not even bring himself to trust fully his instruments of power. A slow surrender, a reluctant corruption. These show us that Melkor's fear deep down was of failure by his very own instruments. I suspect it is this deep fear, masked by all his bluster, that makes Melkor so compelling a character. For in the end, his terror of individual will betrays a profound ignorance. Yes, indeed, ignorance despite his vast knowledge and creative prowess. He cannot understand that the freedom of others is not simply a barrier to overcome, but an elemental part of creation itself. It is one of the reasons for existence, not an obstacle to be obliterated. Melkor's tragedy lies in his refusal to recognize this, in his obstinate insistence that all things should bend and break before his superior might, that choice itself should crumble beneath his strength. Unlike his former peers among the Valar, Melkor views power as a zero-sum game. He is envious of anyone else who possesses autonomy, who plays a tune that is not his own. He fails to see that the music of the Ainur was not a competition to see who could sound the loudest, nor who could impose their notes over others. It was an ensemble, a complex, multivalent creation meant to be enhanced by contrast, by discord that ultimately resolves back into greater harmony. In Melkor's thrashing one senses a note of resentment that he, who should have been the greatest among them, was bound by a melody he could not entirely rewrite. For Melkor, his song was not a contribution but an affront to his imagined supremacy, a personal slight issued by Ilúvatar himself. And here, I would say, is where we find Melkor's ultimate betrayal, not the betrayal of his fellow Ainur or even of Eru Ilúvatar, but of himself. He could have added to the music. He could have been the grandest voice among them. Instead, he becomes a cautionary tale. In seeking to dominate all, Melkor becomes defined by the very thing he rails against, a slave to his own need for control. His legacy is not one of mastery, but of fear, of struggle against inevitability, and of an endless, bitter thrashing against the bars of a self-made cage. What is Melkor in the end but a tragic parody of the very power he seeks? He rages against inevitability, thrashes against the music, and loathes that which he cannot control. His thrashing adds depth and sorrow to the unfolding symphony, but it also reveals his ignorance, a refusal to see that all along his rebellion was a part of the music he so hated. His song, discordant as it was, never strayed beyond the bounds of Eru's design. Melkor, for all his might, was never free, and that in the end is the cruelest irony of them all. He feared freedom because he could not possess it. He desired dominion because he could not attain harmony. He thrashed, he raged, he roared, all the while unknowingly playing his part in a symphony greater than his ambition, a song beyond his comprehension. Melkor's tragedy is not just that he fell. It is that he could have risen higher, had he only understood the true nature of the music.